from the lucid fringe. Ravings from the lucid fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love and beauty. Welcome, I'm Semeric Yarrow.
Ursula and the Spiral Walk. Ursula was a cowherd who lived on a large farm managed by her father, an important local chief. The land was at peace thanks to being led by a king who loved dancing. Ursula's father told her that if she practiced her dancing often enough, she would one day be invited to dance before the king. Her favourite cow, Cindertrude, often allowed her to ride on her back, and so over the years Ursula got transported to all corners of the farm and spent her days dancing freely. However, the farm next door was owned by a wicked wizard, who spent his time in making spells to increase his power over others, from things like bat wings, fox ears, and the invisible tails of frogs. He usually put the creatures through agony before removing the parts he was looking for. He had discovered that in order to have the power to instill fear in everybody around him, and therefore to become king himself, he needed to steal the dance of a young maiden. Now, he found where Ursula was heading one morning, and he sent his ferocious rhinoceros to capture her. The rhino bellowed at Cindertrude and threatened Ursula, and she reluctantly agreed to come with him. Once back at the wizard's lair, the wizard persuaded her to dance with him. Since she had always danced on her own, at first she found that in spite of her shyness she enjoyed the novelty of dancing alongside the wizard. But soon she found that his strange movements were altering her own. Finally, she found to her horror that she could no longer dance. Her body felt like it was in a straitjacket. The wizard cackled a horrible cackle, and bouncing the energy of her dance between his hands, told her she could leave. Distraught, she made her way back to the farm. From that day on, life was hard for Ursula. She would take the cows out, sit and stare across the land, reflecting only on how every day felt grey and flat. Meanwhile, the wizard had taken his new-found power right to the heart of the kingdom, where there had been a beautiful and sacred hill, often visited by all the people for magical ceremonies of renewal. Along the way he cajoled, threatened, and converted more and more supporters of the old king, until the old king was driven into hiding in the forest. Then he blasted down the hill, and in its place raised a forbidding fortress with a tall brown tower at its centre. To this tower he brought young men and women to be his slaves and dance for him. But the dance they danced was a rigid sequence, a formula of movement created and designed by the wizard to create a vortex, holding him invincible at the centre of the kingdom. The years passed, and as Ursula grew, treading the same ground year after year, she came to feel a fresh flutter in her being, a new desire to regain her dance and to move freely. One day, Cindertrude had taken her into a spinney at the far end of the farm, furthest from the wizard's old stamping ground. There was a fine patch of meadow there, with succulent crops for the cattle, and a gentle stream running through it. She lay under a beautiful old milkwood tree and felt drowsy from the day's heat. Suddenly she heard a sweet, soft voice, thick with age. "Ursula, if you wish to regain your dance, you must walk to the heart of the kingdom, and you must do so not in a straight line, but in a spiral from the edge of the kingdom, spiraling inwards across the whole land." Ursula looked around to try and work out who was speaking, and after much puzzling she realized it was the spirit of the milkwood tree itself. She turned to it and reached out to put both her arms around it, loving it with all her might. The tree continued to speak softly to her. "Take with you medicine made from my sap and the nectar of my flowers, dissolved in water from the stream, stirred sunwise. Carry this medicine with you on your spiral journey and greet everybody you meet along the way. But it is most important that you only give this healing medicine to 3 people on your journey to the heart of the kingdom." Ursula prepared the medicine with care and set off for the coast, the edge of the land where her journey would begin. Along the way, she travelled through many different landscapes: deep, lush valleys, dry, wind-swept plains, craggy koppies and thick forests, and she met many people, and greeted each and every one with a smile that grew in confidence the more she travelled. As the spiral completed its circuits, she found herself close again to places she had visited months before, so that with each step she felt both an excitement in the unknown ahead, alongside a growing familiarity with and love for each place she passed. One day she passed a terrible scene, a badly damaged stone track where a man's cart lay on its side, with a wheel wrenched off and his donkey lying trapped under it. The man himself could not move, for the cart had thrown him off and caught his leg, which had shattered. Ursula knew that this was an opportunity to use the healing medicine from the milkwood tree for the first of the 3 times. She carefully spread the ointment along the break, and he was amazed to find his leg coming back to life. He sprang up with joy, and together they managed to lift the cart off the poor donkey, who clambered to her feet. The man expertly fixed his wheel and then invited Ursula back to his house for a supper, with great gratitude for her assistance. When she left the next morning, he gifted her with a miniature harp. "This was a present given to me in the old days by the wise woman of our village. Playing it helps to remove obstacles in the path. I've always been too headstrong to use it, but after yesterday I see its value anew. Use it wisely." Thanking the man, Ursula set off once more. Many more months passed, and she reached a part of the country where a wild, surging river was racing between rocks and cliffs. She sat down to rest beside the river's song, but she suddenly noticed 2 figures on the opposite bank. A woman was weeping and lying beside a drenched child, lying deathly still. Ursula took a long, deep breath and dived into the terrifying river. She hauled her way across and out the other side, and took out once more her healing ointment. She dabbed it onto the middle of the child's forehead, onto her chest and her belly. As the medicine did its work, the pale child choked up water and opened her eyes. Colour began to return to her face, and the woman looked at Ursula as one who had witnessed a miracle. The woman and her daughter embraced each other with delight, and all 3 returned to the woman's cottage, a short distance from the river on a hilly slope. The woman fed Ursula with food from her own wonderful garden, and when Ursula was fully refreshed and had shared her own journey and task, the woman gave her a parting gift. This time it was a pitchfork. "This pitchfork comes down to me from my ancestors. It is always given to one worthy of support from the earth. When you need the assistance of our Earth Mother, dig the fork into the soil, turn it once, and call out, 'Walla walla ho!'" Gratefully, Ursula made her farewells and carried on her walk. The Wizard King had his spies and his messengers, and he was becoming aware of this strange young woman and her journey, and was aware that she was coming closer to his own stronghold. One day, a strange sight met Ursula. On one side of the road lay a decrepit old beggar, moaning and calling out in pain, clearly suffering from some terrible sickness. And on the other side lay a beautiful princess, dressed in her finery, but also moaning after being struck by some unknown malady. Ursula looked to them both in bewilderment. The princess called out in a sweet, silky voice, "Please, please help me. I can reward you well if you can only cure my sickness. You have no idea how much wealth I have at my command. Oh, oh, the agony!" She was very persuasive, but something told Ursula to have a closer look at the beggar, for she knew she could only help one more person. When she came to the beggar, he stopped moaning and looked her deep into the eyes. "You have the power to help me, this I know, but you must choose wisely by trusting your own heart," he whispered. Ursula stood in the middle of the road and breathed, and she felt her heart fluttering, and she knew who to choose. She took the ointment to the beggar and smeared it into his weeping wounds and sores. As she did so, an extraordinary transformation occurred. The beggar began to change into a fine-looking young man, the son of the old king who had been cursed by the wizard. And the princess on the far side of the road snorted loudly. When they turned to look, they only saw the wizard's rhinoceros charging off into the bushes and back to its master in his palace. Accompanied by the prince, Ursula continued on the last leg of her journey, coming into full view of the wizard's palace, but circling it several times as she spiralled inwards. The palace was surrounded by a thick and impenetrable thorny hedge, and the only entrance was hidden by magic controlled by the wizard. The prince could think of no way to enter, but Ursula smiled and took out the miniature harp. As she plucked a simple tune, the branches of the hedge parted into a welcoming avenue, and Ursula and the prince quickly took their strides into the palace grounds. There they were met by the sight of tall, thick turrets, a heavily guarded gate, and walls that were made of an unbreachable stone. The great brown tower rose up above, and the monotonous sound of the sequence dancers carried through the air. Ursula dug her pitchfork into the soil, turned it, and cried out, "Walla walla holla!" As she did so, a great rumbling was heard, and the thick stone walls began to turn into soft soil, with roots growing from the depths. These quickly grew into vines that covered the castle, and Ursula and the prince found a way to climb up the outside of the tower. The two adventurers swung through the windows and into the dance chamber. As her feet landed on the solid floor, Ursula felt the power of the earth surging into her, and with it her body began to shake, and her voice began to wail. It was a deep, blissful wail of release, and she found herself beginning to move in a way that horrified the wizard, sitting triumphant on his throne. The prince felt the power of her dance, and he too began to sway to a different tune. The other dancers in the room began to look up, and waking from their deep trance, they began to stretch and curl to a new beat. The hard walls surrounding them began to shake too, and then to crumble into soft soil. As the Wizard King felt this, he felt his own power beginning to collapse, and something remarkable happened. All the hardness he had held and maintained began to shake him apart, and while he stood in the centre of the room, trying helplessly to fight Ursula's fresh magic, he began to shrink, his features tightening ever more until all that was left of him was a brilliantly hard, many-faceted jewel. Ursula and the prince picked up the jewel, which throbbed with its own contained power, and they took it with them as they led a dance out of the collapsing palace and through the land, followed by all the other dancers, leaping with joy and delight in their new freedom. Eventually they reached the distant forest, where the old king and his followers retained a simple court in a mossy cave. The king emerged, blinking, bent with age, but still with a simple and humble dignity. He turned and embraced his son, and many tears were shed. The prince told his father of Ursula's brave journey, and as the king nodded sagely, he spoke softly but clearly so that all could hear. "My son, it has been a troubled time for our kingdom. According to the old traditions, you should now rule the land. But it is for you to decide what should truly happen now, trusting in your own deep wisdom." The prince bowed his head, and there was silence. Then he looked up with a sparkle in his eyes. "My father, my lord, a new dance has been danced these last days. Ursula should rule this land. I will listen to her wishes, for I trust her abilities and her courage to rule wisely and well. There will be joy and freedom in this land once more." And with great cries of surprise and delight, the crowd also felt the wisdom of his words. At her coronation in the forest, Cindertrude came as the guest of honour, and all pledged their allegiance to the new dancing queen of the realm. So, thank you for listening to this latest episode in the series, and you can find all of my articles and my recordings at lucidfringe.substack.com, except my music and poetry from the past, which is all available at simrickyarrow, all one word, .bandcamp.com, and the background recordings and sounds that you will have heard are all either from those recordings or they are my own. Please do give this a rating if it's on your podcast app. Please spread the word if you enjoy what you hear, and if you want to give me some feedback or commentary, of course I'm very open to that. Any suggestions for future episodes? Okay, enjoy.